On November 22, 1963, a single gunshot changed America forever. But while the world focused on the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, a forgotten figure was left to bear the consequences: his wife, Marina Oswald Porter. This gripping cinematic documentary dives deep into the life of Marina Oswald, a young Soviet immigrant who came to America in search of a future, only to be thrust into the eye of history's most infamous storm. From her turbulent marriage to Oswald, her interrogation by the FBI, to her later doubts about the official story, Marina's journey is one of survival, suspicion, and sorrow. Who was the real Marina Oswald Porter, spy or scapegoat, pawn or survivor? Join us as we unravel the haunting true story of the woman behind America's darkest day, Marina Oswald Porter, born Marina Nikolaevna Prusakova. She was the wife of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man arrested for the assassination of President Kennedy and then himself killed on live television just 2 days later by a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. In the frantic 72 hours that turned her life upside down, Marina transformed from a quiet, isolated housewife into the so-called wife of America's most hated man. She became the subject of endless speculation and relentless public scrutiny, carrying a massive weight of suspicion for events she did not even witness firsthand. For many Americans, she was the woman behind the gun, a suspicious Soviet figure rumored to be part of elaborate conspiracies, while for others, she was a tragic bystander, just a young mother of two in the wrong place at the worst possible time. How did a young Soviet woman end up at the epicenter of this American tragedy? Let's rewind the clock to her early years. Marina was born in 1941 in a place called Molotovsk, today known as Severodvinsk, in the Arkhangelsk Oblast of the former Soviet Union. This was right in the thick of World War II, a time of unimaginable hardship for millions across Europe and beyond. Like many children of that era, Marina had a difficult childhood marked by deprivation, strict discipline, and a sense that the political system was always looming in the background. She lost her mother at a young age, and the rearing she received was shaped by a stepfather and the broader Soviet environment, where fear of authority often dictated daily life. Imagine living in a society where speaking against the government could land you in severe trouble, or, at the very least, cause you to vanish from official records. That was the kind of environment in which Marina grew up, forging her quiet, introspective nature. By the late 1950s, she had moved to Minsk to live with an uncle who was a colonel in the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs. There she studied pharmacy, a respectable choice in a country that boasted free education but strict academic pathways. She was a petite, reserved young woman who found solace in reading and, according to later recollections, rarely drew attention to herself. That is until she caught the eye of an American defector named Lee Harvey Oswald. He was a former U.S. Marine who had renounced his American citizenship, at least temporarily, out of disillusionment with capitalist society. He arrived in the Soviet Union in 1959, determined to start a new life there. Their meeting at a dance in early 1961 proved fateful. They felt an odd connection, two outsiders in a city brimming with Soviet nationals. Within just 6 weeks, Marina agreed to marry this man whose background and motives were as mysterious to her as the distant land he came from. A quick wedding followed, and in their early days together, life seemed to revolve around domestic routines and the novelty of bridging cultural gaps. Marina was eager to learn about Oswald's American roots, while he honed his Russian language skills. They had their first daughter, June, in February 1962. But the Soviet paradise wasn't what Oswald had expected. Disillusioned, once again, he made the choice to return to the United States, and in June 1962, the Oswald family arrived on American soil. They settled in Dallas, Texas, a city that would soon become synonymous with national tragedy. Marina was only in her early 20s when she found herself in a completely foreign country. She didn't speak English, didn't have her own money, and had almost no support system aside from a handful of acquaintances, like Ruth Payne, who would become a key figure in their lives. Such isolation would be suffocating for anyone. Imagine moving to another continent, barely knowing the language, having an infant to care for, and relying on a mercurial spouse who was unemployed half the time. Oswald struggled to keep a job, his temperament was volatile, and he displayed what would later be interpreted as strange obsessions with politics, both Soviet and American. The tension in their marriage grew as Oswald's anger became more pronounced. There were incidents, as Marina would later recount, of physical abuse. He forbade her from learning English, supposedly so he could keep practicing his Russian, but many have speculated it was to maintain control over her. People often wonder why she stayed. Why didn't she just leave? But the question overlooks her reality. She was in a foreign land, had a baby daughter, no income, minimal language skills, and no certainty that returning to the Soviet Union was even an option. The fact is, one of the few times she attempted to leave, she sought refuge with friends. But with nowhere to go and no means to support herself, she inevitably returned to Oswald. It's a classic scenario of dependency that traps many in abusive relationships. And in Marina's case, it occurred under the unique stress of cross-cultural barriers during a time of intense Cold War paranoia. Fast forward to 1963. Tensions in their marriage were high. They were living separately at times. Marina stayed with Ruth Payne in Irving, while Oswald bounced between Dallas and brief stints in New Orleans. She became pregnant again and gave birth to their second daughter, Audrey, on October 20th, 1963. Imagine that. A newborn at home, an older toddler running around, and a husband whose behavior was anything but stable. She began noticing his strange habits. He'd clean his rifle meticulously. He wrote ominous notes and talked about big political ideas that sometimes bordered on unhinged conspiracy. Then came that fateful day in late November, the day that would shake the world. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed during a motorcade through downtown Dallas. Within hours, the authorities zeroed in on Lee Harvey Oswald, who worked in the Texas School Book Depository. Marina, just 22 years old, found herself in a vortex of confusion and dread. Her husband had just been arrested for the murder of the president. 2 days later, before Oswald could even stand trial, he was shot by Jack Ruby, a scene broadcast live to the entire nation. If this chain of events sounds like it's ripped straight from a suspense novel, that's because it practically is, except it was real life. Suddenly, the entire media circus pivoted toward Marina. She was the closest link to the man who might have altered the course of American history with 3 bullets from a 6th-floor window. Cameras and flashing bulbs documented her every move. FBI agents swarmed her. She was interrogated dozens of times. You can imagine how terrifying this must have been. The entire planet is looking at you, demanding answers about a heinous crime you never had anything to do with. The public reaction was predictably polarized. Some labeled her a Soviet spy, a honey trap, an instrument of the KGB who ensnared Oswald in a broader plot to eliminate an American president. Others pitied her, viewing her as the helpless young mother of 2 who'd just lost a husband. By that point, a man widely reviled, but a loss for her nonetheless. She was also vulnerable in a country that was not her own, with minimal command of the language and no financial security. Within days, Marina went from an unknown Soviet immigrant to a symbol either of suspicion or of compassion, depending on who you asked. Throughout the investigations, first with the Dallas police, then the FBI, and finally the Warren Commission, Marina revealed pieces of her life with Oswald. She admitted to taking the infamous backyard photos of him holding the rifle that was allegedly used to shoot President Kennedy. These photographs became some of the most scrutinized images in American history. Conspiracy theorists have long argued that they were doctored, claiming lighting inconsistencies or strange shadows as evidence of tampering. But Marina consistently maintained that the photos were genuine. She also recounted Oswald's earlier attempt to assassinate General Edwin Walker, a vehement anti-communist, back in April 1963, an incident often overshadowed by the magnitude of the Kennedy assassination. Despite sharing such stories, her credibility was challenged at every turn. She was questioned about her own loyalties and battered by insinuations that she was more involved than she admitted. She was only in the country by virtue of her marriage to Oswald. With him gone, there was a looming possibility of deportation back to the Soviet Union. It's not hard to see how such a threat could influence her testimony or how it might make her extremely wary of any official questioning. Ultimately, she told the Warren Commission what she believed, or at least what she thought was safest to believe at that time, that her husband acted alone. In front of a global audience, she painted Lee Harvey Oswald as a troubled, violent, and resentful man who might well have committed the assassination single-handedly. But that was not the end of her story. Despite the Commission's conclusion in 1964 that Oswald was the lone gunman, controversies kept swirling around Marina for decades. She was a key witness who had physically taken that notorious photo. She'd lived side by side with the man at the heart of an American tragedy. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, she tried to rebuild her life. In 1965, she remarried, this time to a man named Kenneth Porter, an ordinary American, someone who worked in electronics, liked drag racing, and provided the stable, quiet life she had never known. She took his last name, becoming Marina Porter. They had a child together, and she attempted to disappear from public view, settling in Texas. Yet the name Oswald shadowed her wherever she went. One can only imagine the reaction she might have gotten whenever she introduced herself in any context. I used to be Marina Oswald. That name was, and to some extent still is, synonymous with the single most debated crime in modern American history. She'd shop at grocery stores, picking out produce and hearing the whispers, catching the curious stares. Journalists periodically tracked her down, snapping grainy photos for tabloid headlines. The American public, especially during anniversaries of the assassination, like the 10th, 20th, 25th, 30th, 40th, and 50th, would be reminded of her existence. Wasn't she that Russian lady who was married to, the guy who shot JFK? She rarely engaged with the press, especially once she remarried. But that didn't stop rumors from swirling. Some insisted she was part of a grand conspiracy. Others said she'd been a tragic pawn. Few people stepped back to acknowledge that she was primarily a survivor of extraordinary circumstances. Though she tried to build a quiet family life, she made a stunning pivot in the 1980s and 1990s when she began expressing doubts about the official account of the assassination. Suddenly, the woman who once testified that her husband acted alone was entertaining theories that a larger plot was at play. She began publicly suggesting that Oswald may have been a patsy, or at least not the sole person behind Kennedy's murder. Conspiracy buffs latched onto her statements as validation of their own suspicions. Skeptics pointed out that she had changed her story dramatically over the years, suggesting that she was either confused, manipulated, or simply seeking attention. But to many it came across as the authentic journey of someone who'd spent decades haunted by an event that upended her entire life, and who eventually concluded that the official story didn't add up. Imagine how psychologically heavy this burden must have been. Over 20, 30, then 40 years, she'd lived with the knowledge that her first husband was accused of killing the President of the United States. At first, she told investigators he likely did it. Maybe because that was what everyone expected her to say, or maybe because it was the only narrative that made sense in the hurricane of suspicion. But as time went on, she might have felt that the puzzle had missing pieces. The House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s concluded there was a high probability of conspiracy, fueling more speculation. New pieces of evidence would surface from time to time: audio recordings, ballistics tests, or revelations from previously classified documents. Perhaps these developments, coupled with the swirling theories, planted seeds of doubt in her mind. And so she began to speak out in interviews, saying she did not believe Lee acted alone. She felt something bigger was behind it all. Was it the CIA, the mafia, anti-Castro exiles, Soviet operatives? Everyone had a theory. And because Marina was intimately connected to Lee Harvey Oswald, her words carried more weight than your average conspiracy blogger. She essentially morphed from the killer's wife into an unintentional spokesperson for those who believed in a conspiracy. The shift in her public stance was never exactly welcome. She didn't crave the spotlight, nor did she seem to enjoy rehashing the trauma. But she reached a point where she felt morally compelled to speak. As she once insinuated, she had spent years in enforced silence, both out of fear of the government and fear of the harsh glare of public opinion. But by the time the 1980s and 1990s rolled around, that fear gave way to frustration with official narratives she saw as incomplete or deliberately misleading. Over the decades, both professional and amateur investigators tried to glean any scrap of information from her that might solve the endless riddle of the JFK assassination. Did Marina know in those weeks leading up to November 22nd that Oswald was planning something catastrophic? Could she have intervened? Did she see him practicing with the rifle in their backyard? Did she read any letters that implied a larger group was involved? While she did confirm seeing him with a rifle, she insisted she had no clear idea of what he was planning. She did mention a deeply unsettling feeling, a kind of dread that something terrible was going to happen, but she lacked the context or the power to stop it. These reflections became recurring themes whenever she reluctantly granted interviews. In many ways, Marina remains a symbol of an era. She was a Soviet immigrant during the height of the Cold War, married to an American defector who then returned to the U.S. The optics of their relationship alone read like a spy novel, the ex-Marine with communist sympathies and the Russian bride. It all seemed almost too cinematic to be real, which is precisely why so many suspected some deeper espionage angle. For a time, U.S. authorities indeed entertained the notion that she might be a KGB agent, but no substantial evidence ever emerged to confirm that. Instead, she appeared to be what she claimed to be, a young woman who'd fallen in love with an American in Minsk, married quickly, and followed him to a land of promise, only to find herself caught up in a tragedy far beyond her control. Her personal tragedies didn't end with November 1963. She struggled financially for quite some time, reliant on donations that poured in during her initial period of public exposure. She later sold some of Oswald's possessions to support herself and her children. She gave up the ring he gave her, writing a heartfelt note about how it symbolized a past she no longer wished to be tethered to. Over the years, she guarded her privacy so fiercely that she put up no trespassing signs around her home, refusing to answer the door to anyone, especially on the anniversaries of the assassination when journalists predictably came knocking. She also dealt with the heartbreak of raising two daughters who, through no fault of their own, bore the stigma of their father's infamous name. Both June and Rachel faced taunts in school. Classmates would hiss, "Your daddy shot Kennedy." It was a generational curse that Marina could neither fully prevent nor entirely help them navigate. Eventually, as she aged into her 60s, 70s, and beyond, she became an ever more elusive figure. When she did speak up, rarely, it was often to reaffirm her belief in Oswald's likely innocence, or at least partial innocence. Media outlets sometimes sensationalize these appearances, calling her a reclusive widow or a tragic figure. Others painted her as a cameo in the American story of JFK, overshadowed by more flamboyant characters like Jack Ruby or theories of mafia ties. And yet, for all the sensational coverage, the deeper human drama remains. She was a woman catapulted into the darkest corner of American history, left to pick up the pieces of her life and never truly escaping the shadow of that bullet that ended Kennedy's life. It's crucial to recognize the phenomenon she represents, a reluctant symbol of Cold War tension embedded in an all-too-real human saga. Her plight underscores how personal fates can be shaped by geopolitics. Think about the average person who immigrates under normal circumstances. They face culture shock, financial difficulties, language barriers. Now magnify that 100-fold. She was not just an immigrant. She was the widow of the alleged presidential assassin in the middle of the most heated era of U.S.-Soviet rivalry. Even if she had never had a single suspicious thought in her life, the climate of the time automatically painted her as a suspect. So she withdrew from the world, partially to shield herself and partially to protect her children from the unending scrutiny. But with the passage of time, many began to see Marina not as an accomplice, but as a tragic figure. She hadn't chosen to be in the headlines. She never asked to be the subject of FBI interrogations or media speculation. If anything, she exemplified the notion of the bystander who becomes part of history by accident. Her story invites questions about personal agency. Could she have changed the course of history had she done something differently? She herself has acknowledged that question, hinting that she sometimes wondered if reporting her suspicions or leaving Oswald might have saved Kennedy's life. But that's the kind of speculation that can drive a person to despair. Hindsight always clarifies events. In the moment, her primary concern was likely how to survive day to day with two small children and an unstable spouse in a foreign land. As the decades wore on, Americans also changed how they remembered JFK and the assassination. The national climate shifted from the raw shock of the 1960s to a more reflective stance, especially post-Watergate and Vietnam. People began to question the narratives once taken at face value. That environment opened the door for Marina's later statements, making them more acceptable to a public newly aware that government bodies could be deceptive or incomplete in their reporting. Conspiracy theories about the assassination multiplied. Was it the Cubans, the Mafia, the CIA, or some combination thereof? More recent revelations, such as certain CIA documents indicating that Lee Harvey Oswald had been on the radar of intelligence services, further fueled doubt. Each time these developments surfaced, reporters would angle for an interview with Marina, hoping she might reveal a new detail or a changed perspective. In the end, Marina Oswald Porter stands as one of the most enduring figures in the tapestry of modern American history. She reminds us that behind the conspiracy theories and the official reports, behind the ballistic evidence and the reams of investigative files, are ordinary human stories. Stories of a wife, a mother, a stranger in a strange land, forced into the spotlight by events she never orchestrated. She was and remains a figure who symbolizes both the tragedy and the confusion of the JFK assassination era. She's the accidental historian who kept the secrets of a tumultuous household locked in her heart, perhaps struggling to differentiate between truth, memory, and the illusions imposed upon her by decades of official narratives and public scrutiny. She didn't ask for the role, but she inherited it nonetheless, and she carried it for a lifetime. Her story is a testament to the fact that sometimes history chooses us, and once chosen, we can never fully extricate ourselves from its hold.